guys, thank you for your patience. Apologies. As we said, we had come in early and not to no avail. So I'm just starting with this picture. For those of you who've been to New Zealand, does anybody know where this is? It's not necessarily too easy. It's not too hard, but it's illustrative. Chris, if anyone does put in the answer in the chat, I'd love to know. I don't expect anyone to get it, but I'm not trying to be arcane or difficult. I'm just trying to point out this is just Tuesday in New Zealand. You've got this dramatic coastline, you've got train, you've got this wonderful path, and there are so many moments or scenes like this that you'll find when you go to this country. And I think the minute that you think you've seen the most beautiful thing you've ever seen in New Zealand, the next day will come or the next hour will come. And so this one was actually for my most recent visit. I was in New Zealand January of 2020, just for a few days to visit a friend. So this was taken from that trip. And there's the beginning of my presentation. Plan your trip to New Zealand, also known as Middle Earth, also known as the most memorable vacation of my life. I don't have any fancy TED Talk style presentation. I'm just going to be very journalistic with you. The who, what, why, where, when, and how for this trip. And as Chris alluded to, it's important to note this is not your classic backpacker trip where you're not going to be spending a lot of money. I knew that I was going to be spending a fair amount of money to visit New Zealand, but I didn't really know until the end just how much I was going to spend to visit. So starting with the who. Obviously, if you're a solo traveler, you only solo travel, that's your jam. I'm not here to persuade you to not solo travel to New Zealand. Not only is it great for solo travelers, but there are so many people on the trail that you'll keep running into like some of the same people, especially if you're going in the same direction around one of the islands. So solo travelers, feel free. New Zealand's great for that. However, it also is fun to travel with friends. And I happen to travel with two friends who I'd never traveled with them for more than 7 days before, and on different places. So with Kat, I traveled with her in the US. She's on the left of the photo, my right, and then Terry on the right of the photo, my left. She's an investor and a friend of mine, but we've done a fair amount of travel in Europe. But with neither of these women had I ever traveled for more than 7 days, and they'd never met each other. So it was a tremendous risk. I'm sure everyone knows friendships have ended after vacation, marriages have ended after vacations. So this was a risk for everybody, but it ended up not only being a wonderful trip, but we call ourselves the hashtag Dream Team now. Like each of us filled a role that we just sort of slid into during the trip. Someone was the navigator, someone was cooking, making coffee, someone was calling ahead to find out about, helicopter flights or fun things or restaurants. So I'm not saying that you should necessarily risk your friendship with someone that you care about, but I will tell you that if your friendship survives a 30-day trip, it's going to be just 90 days. You went through this wonderful experience together. Something like a fun version of boot camp, you could say. This picture was taken, this is off the coast of the South Island of Akaroa. We were whale and dolphin watching that day, and we're on a sailboat, and I'm behind the wheel. So I have sort of my pirate pose there for a moment. But we're actually planning, at the moment, we are planning a follow-up trip to New Zealand, another 30 days together as a team. What do you want? I should say as a PS to the Dream Team. I asked a travel group that I manage on Facebook. People knew I'd been talking about going to New Zealand for some years, but I just put up on Facebook. I said I'm going to go in about a year. If anybody else would like to go to New Zealand, I will take care of the logistics. I'll split the costs. Just leave it to me. And there were so many people who over the years had said they wanted to go. None of those people said that they were going to go. And I don't know whether they didn't want to go with me, they didn't want to go that year, whatever it was. And neither Terry nor Kat had ever told me they were interested in New Zealand. But it ended up the people who didn't tell me that they were interested actually ended up showing up when I said I was going to go. So now that you know a little bit about the who, the what, do you want to do a survey of New Zealand, both islands, or do you want to focus in one area? I totally appreciate the focus perspective, especially if you're young enough to do a working holiday visa where you just, let's say, work real hard for 6 months, gather up a bunch of cash, and then spend another 6 months traveling in New Zealand. I think that would be great. You'd really get to know the particular area you're working on, although a lot of those working holiday visas, you're working 12-hour days. So you don't necessarily get to know that area very well, but you can build up friendships and resources for the rest of your trip. I tend to be a survey person. It allows you to experience more of the country. You can always go back to focus later. And in fact, we built this trip with the idea that we were gonna go back, and the parts that we left off of this trip are focused. So we didn't just kind of scatter across both islands. We picked parts of North Island and parts of South Island that we weren't going to get to, and on the second trip we were going to. And New Zealand isn't large. It's not large. Now, for those of you who are wondering, and there's a sort of funny meme going around at the moment, even including the New Zealand Prime Minister, in which New Zealand is being left off the map, and they think it's a conspiracy, and it's a sort of a New Zealand tourism board thing. I use MapFight a lot when I travel. If I'm at couchsurfing meetings or nomadic network events, if someone says they're from Namibia, for example, and I have no idea how big Namibia is, I'll use MapFight. It's a website. You can just put in the name of the country and then what you want to compare it to. So if someone says, I'm using Namibia, then I try to find another country that I do have a sense of what the scale is. And so for most people, I picked the UK, so you would have an idea. So for most Europeans, they know how big the UK is. Even Americans who've never been to the UK, they have a vague sense of it, I think. Although most Americans don't know the difference between Britain and England. That's a different story. But you can see New Zealand and the United Kingdom as a whole are close to the same size. The UK is a little smaller, but that should just give you some sense and hopefully give you a tool to interact with fellow travelers in the future. Why? So obviously Lord of the Rings, and then seriously Instagram. But beyond obviously those two reasons, everyone who I'd ever talked to, when they talked about New Zealand, they just got this sort of starry, magical look in their eyes. And I thought, wow, that's special. I'd like to go. And a lot of people talk about Corsica the same way here in France. Every person I've ever spoken to about Corsica, they get this sort of starry-eyed. And I had planned to go to Corsica last year, but some weird thing happened and I wasn't able to go. So Corsica is next on the list, but it's probably because I'm an island person. I was born in Singapore on an island, and so I have a special affinity for islands. But New Zealand is particularly special. Why not? Because you don't want to be trendy. I get it. Okay. I suppose that's 50% of the reason I haven't gone to Iceland. The other 50% is it's ludicrously expensive to go to Iceland. And I budget myself to destinations, and everyone and their mom's dog was going to Iceland. And so I get it. If there's part of you that says, oh, Stephen, everybody's going to New Zealand, I don't want to go. I get it, because part of that animates my travels as well. However, you're really missing out on New Zealand if you don't. So maybe just in this particular instance, consider going with the trendies. New Zealand is not going to become unpopular anytime soon. Where? If you only have 2 weeks, I would pretty forcibly insist on South Island only. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. If you have 1 month, I would argue for my itinerary, 2 weeks on each island. If you have 2 months, I would go 1 month on each island. But if you have 3 months, again, my South Island bias comes through. 1 month on North Island, 2 months on South Island. The seat of government is in the North Island. 75% of the population is in North Island. Rivendell is in the North Island. So is Hobbiton. However, all of the spectacular beauty, almost all of it, is in the south. Well, that's not fair. Let's say 75. If it's true that 75% of the population lives in North Island, 75% of the views are in South Island. Where part two? Don't worry, North Island, I still love you. And then I whispered South Island. I'm just kidding. I don't care about North Island at all. I would never say just skip it. But as I said, if you only had 2 weeks, I wouldn't go to North Island. I would spend it all on South Island. Whereas, as you notice with my other itineraries, I really am encouraging you to see both sides. So where in North Island? This is just an example of an itinerary. And I can answer some, if you have other targets that you see for both North Island and South Island that you want to speak to specifically, I can tell you about them, why I didn't choose to go, or if I did and I didn't mention them specifically here. Auckland, there's nothing really in Auckland. It's a pretty ugly city. It's not Auckland's fault. I just that's how it is. But you're going to use it as a jumping off point for the Bay of Islands. So the north, if any of you have ever been to the Whitsundays in Australia, there's just what happens when you have this collection of volcanic islands. That's what's going up on the Bay of Islands. So people sail from these small little islands, and you can rent a sailboat and do that. There's also smaller islands around. In fact, there's a dormant volcano in Auckland, which you can go up to, which is worth seeing. So there are islands right around Auckland that you can take day trips to. One of them is Waiheke. And there's actually some really great wine tasting in Waiheke. Waitomo Caves, very famous for its glowworms. Hobbiton, of course, everybody knows about Hobbiton. Interestingly enough, Terry, one of the dream team who'd come I know this is difficult to believe for the Lord of the Rings fans in here, but Terry had not only never read the books, but she'd never seen the films. So this woman goes to Hobbiton having never known anything about Lord of the Rings. And so like I told her, I said, just don't tell your friends who are Lord of the Rings fans about this. But what happened was we then downloaded the Audibles, the Ian Holm version of the BBC, and we listened to those as we were driving around New Zealand together. So she listened to The Hobbit, all of the Lord of the Rings. She got to go to Hobbiton. It was pretty awesome for her. Mount Manganui is on the east coast of North Island. Beautiful views. Rangitoto National Park is very famous for one of those hikes that everyone talks about in the guidebooks, and I'm going to warn people off of. Generally, there are some other really magnificent hikes you can take in that national park, and the one that everyone talks about, which is one of the longest in New Zealand and one of the most talked about, everyone who I talked to on the trail that went regretted it, because everyone is stopping for the same photo, which we've all and I've been guilty of this to an extent. I don't want to pretend I'm some purist, but everyone's lining up for that one shot, right? And instead of just enjoying the hike and being part of it. Napier is a town that was destroyed in an earthquake in the 1920s, and they rebuilt it in a Art Deco style, because Art Deco was really popular at the time. So if you want to see like Art Deco movie theater, Art Deco hotels, Art Deco restaurants, Napier's for you. Now you're getting towards the south of North Island. And I want you to remember, we're south of the equator now. So as we go south, it's getting colder. And when you go north, it gets hotter, okay? So as we're going south in North Island, you've got two wonderful wine regions. Now, South Island actually is what's responsible for New Zealand's international wine reputation. And I think this overshadows the very fine quality of the North Island wines. And I live in France, I can't escape being a total wine snob, but the New Zealand North Island wines are wonderful. And then Wellington is at the very bottom of South Island. Sorry, the very bottom of North Island. It's across the water from South Island. You can take a ferry or you can fly across. And Wellington's got, it's a lot like Hobart, Tasmania, for those of you who've been there. It's just a real happening town. It's the capital. It's the windiest city I've ever been to. I remember being in a friend's apartment and the wind is just blowing and it sounds like a haunted house, right? Like, ooh, ooh. And I was telling her, I said, this is crazy. She's like, oh, this is nothing, right? Like she's like, implying this is like Tuesday. This is wait till it really starts blowing. But it's very, 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 very windy. The Wellingtonians will claim it's the windiest city in the world. I don't actually know that. I will lose that on the pub quiz if that actually ends up being the case. What are some of the things you can see on North Island? Well, you can go to Sam Gamgee's house, those of you who know that. Bottom right, that steam is rising from a town called Rotorua. Rotorua is one of the most active places in the world geothermically. And that means the whole town smells like sulfur, smells like rotten eggs. But I actually wasn't bothered by that as much as I thought I was going to be. It was really wonderful to see all the different ways that this manifested, whether it was bubbling mud or hot water. And then the top right, that's on the way in between one of the wine regions in North Island. And again, if you think about the islands themselves, when people, I know this will be difficult to believe, but there are plenty of people in New Zealand who they're born and raised in New Zealand. They've never been to South Island. And I remember talking to people about that, and I couldn't hide my open mouth shock, because I understand it's the natives' curse. Anywhere you go, you'll run into Americans who haven't seen a lot of America. You'll run into French people who haven't seen a lot of France. You'll run into Italians who haven't seen a lot of Italy. But I get that. That's nothing to beat people up for. But I did tease the North Island New Zealanders. I'm like, you realize people fly from all over the world to go to South Island? Why aren't you just like, oh, well, I'll go sometime. Just one of those things no, someday is not a day of the week. Here's just a really fun sign from the North Island wineries. In case you're wondering, wine is available. And it was just such a cool picture. And again, what's interesting about the growing wine industry worldwide, so this isn't just a New Zealand thing. If you go to Chile, if you go to different parts of the world that are new in growing wine, there's so much information being shared on the internet now about best practices, biodynamic growing, that the quality of the wine is just so good. And I think that's the challenge, is especially if you live in an old world country like I do, and that you get a beat into you that the old world is all that matters. You're just prepared for wine that's not that great, and you're just so blown away by these new world wines. And I was too, very, very pleasantly surprised by New Zealand. So where? South Island Part 1. So Christchurch, as some of you may know, was partially destroyed by an earthquake some years ago. And as I talked with some of the locals about why there's, let's say, a destroyed church that's still destroyed and then a brand new building like 2 doors down, it comes down to sort of government funding and the slowness of bureaucracy. So the country funneled a bunch of money to Christchurch. Christchurch is a smaller town, not really used to having a large administration, not used to having national and international scrutiny as to what it's doing with the money. And so they're afraid to spend the money because they think they're going to get called out for bad things. So there's just been a real stoppage there, unfortunately. So there's large parts of Christchurch that are still, it looks like the earthquake happened a couple of days ago. The Raikaya Gorge, I do have a picture later on of the Raikaya Gorge. Akaroa, which is one of the few places that it still has, so I don't have time to get into this, but New Zealand could have been colonized by the French. We're talking about a matter of days as to who landed where at what time. So Akaroa still had a French colony, and they made a deal with the English because these settlers had showed up to what they thought was going to be a French settlement, and the English were there. And the English, being financially minded, they said, hey, listen, you do the French things. We're in charge, okay? And so they spoke French there. They used French customs duties, all of these other things. So Akaroa still has, and they've been trying to grow it in recent years, a sort of French population. So some of the streets are named in French. They have French bakeries. So it's really pleasant and fun to run into that. Kaikoura has got a lot of marine wildlife, so I got to see some native New Zealand bottlenose dolphins there. They're not in any other part of the world. Hang out with seals. They're just out there. There's been enough discipline among the tourists that they don't run away if you get within a reasonable distance. Obviously, you don't get too close to them. The Marlborough wine region, which is what New Zealand's international wine reputation is based off of, is in South Island, and then Abel Tasman National Park. There is an Abel Tasman National Park in Tasmania, in Australia. So those of you who are thinking there is, don't worry. This is the north of South Island that I've been talking about. So some of the sites. So you can see there's one of the seal families that I got to hang out with in Kaikoura. When I say hang out with, I literally just took a sandwich and sat. You can see it's maybe about 10 or 15 feet away. I just hung out there and watched them swim back and forth and sing to each other. And that was that. On the left is, this isn't the glacier itself, but you can just see the quality of the water. This is near the Fox Glacier. There's two major glaciers on South Island, the Franz Josef Glacier and the Fox Glacier. And then on the bottom right is the view as you're coming into Akaroa. So as you come around the corner and you look down into the valley and you think, okay, not a bad view. One of probably the best views of my life on going into someplace. And I wasn't expecting it. I think someone had told me that it was a good view going in, but you think, okay, yeah, great. It's a good view going in. What are you thinking? And then you look at a picture like that and you're like, okay, I get it. It was pretty awesome. So these are just a few of the pictures from South Island. Now going a little further south on South Island, so middle and south, I talked about the Franz Josef and the Fox glaciers. So these glaciers, unfortunately, have retreated a lot in the same way that we've seen glaciers retreat in Switzerland and other parts of the world. And you've actually been able to see, here's where the glacier was in 1905, here was where the glacier was in 1929, etc. And you keep following it up. And I'm trying to think about this because it's both, it's tough to see, but at the same time, it's fascinating because as the glacier has retreated, you're able to see the effects of a glacier in geography. So this, when a glacier drags back, you see, okay, here a valley gets carved out. So you're able to walk through this valley that's been carved out for the last 100 years from this retreating glacier. You wouldn't be able to see that otherwise. So that part of it's very positive. The negative part is you see, it's like, well, how much further is this glacier going to retreat before you don't get to see it anymore? And so I remember telling a lot of my Kiwi friends, like, you better get down to the glaciers before they disappear. Okarito is on the west coast of South Island. Now, interestingly enough, the west coast of South Island is there's no development. You'll go to these beaches. The same sort of attitude. The west, if any of you have ever been to Colombia, the west coast of Colombia is totally deserted. There's no development. You think it's a beach, South America. Same thing here. You think, oh, it's this beautiful beach, totally deserted. For whatever reason, it just never developed. And I'm glad. Okarito, Lake Matheson, the Haas Pass, which until I visit Norway, Chris, the Haas Pass is the most beautiful drive of my life. I'm told there's this somewhat ridiculous drive in Norway that I need to get to. But at the moment, the most ridiculous drive of my life is the Haas Pass. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Wanaka, Arrowtown, Queenstown, the Otago wine region, which is an up and coming wine region in the south of South Island, and then Mount Cook. So there is Fox Glacier. As I say, you can see they stop us. We can't go any further. Now, interestingly enough, at the Franz Josef Glacier, there are helicopter rides. And my friend Terry took one of those. It's like a couple $100, maybe $200-300 to fly to the top. So these helicopters will take you and you can stand at the top of the glacier. And I'm sure that's pretty cool. She told me it was one of the experiences of her life. You can see there's this just sort of fun sign, glacier, just this way. And then the bottom right, Lake Matheson is what I was talking about. And you might think, oh, Stephen, that's really great. And I'm like, that's just somebody's backyard in New Zealand, right? When you see views like that, it's there. I really want to emphasize, it's nothing special. part of the challenge of South Island, and even particularly as you drive in the Haas Pass, you'll come to a spot and you'll say, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. This is ridiculous. And then you'll go around the corner and you're like, okay, this is actually the most beautiful. Whatever I just saw sucks, right? By comparison, this is actually the most beautiful thing. And you just find yourself, especially particularly in South Island, confronting amazing views, wildlife, experiences over and over. There's just no getting around it. I don't know what else to say. You need more evidence? Here you go. So on the left, that's Mount Cook. That is a natural lake. So you're wondering, why is it aquamarine? I'm sure there's some people who know that the water can reflect both the minerality of the water itself and the particular way that the sun is shining on a given day. So I just want to point out, you look at the picture on the left, that is a freshwater lake. And in the top right, that is the northern coast of South Island. That's I just took that at Abel Tasman National Park, just through the woods while I was on the trail. And you can see that water is quite similar. That's seawater that has nothing to do with minerality. And then, of course, the freshwater lake in front of Mount Cook has everything to do with minerality, but they still managed to draw on some of those same colors. And then bottom right, this is just north of Queenstown in a place called, I'm not kidding, called Paradise. That's the name of the town. And these sheep are just hanging out. You know, I often, as I drive past the sheep in New Zealand, I'm like, do you guys know how beautiful this country is? I ask the sheep this all the time. And I just don't think they're fully acquainted with how ridiculously beautiful their country is. And one more money shot, in case you needed any more evidence for South Island. This is Queenstown. Now I want you to imagine I've never flown into Queenstown, but I've had friends who have. And your plane is coming in through these mountains, this lake, this view. Now, I want to point out, I'm not even looking at Queenstown. I've climbed up some hills called the Remarkables. And I'm just looking down slightly to the north of Queenstown, just to the bend in the river. And I just wanted to get a sort of characteristic shot. But I just want to point out again, this is nothing special in the sense of this is just New Zealand. And it is a shot that anyone can take. Like I don't have a special DSLR camera. Just all of New Zealand is photogenic and waiting for you to come and experience it. When is best? So part of this was influenced by my own pleasurable experiences in Australia during Australia's summer. And so I necessarily thought, well, I'm going to go to New Zealand in the summer, of course, as well, which is particularly convenient for those of us who live in the Northern Hemisphere when it's January. And I can't complain because Chris is on the call and he's living in Scandinavia. So I can't complain about Northern France. But there's nothing sweeter than leaving winter in Europe to go to summer in Australia or New Zealand. It's one of the best things ever. I've done that multiple times now. December to March, I want to point out, it's also the most expensive time to go. So it's no big surprise. Also, it's become very, very popular among the Chinese now, and the Chinese go there during Chinese New Year. So that is a very, very big population that comes down there. Shoulder season's cheaper, and as is the case with many parts of the world, so that's November and April. Winter is cheapest, but it's also the most difficult. There's places you'll see signs for it during the summertime, not available, closed during the winter. I talked to some of the hotel staff at some of the national parks, like, oh, we close during parts of the winter. So it will be probably cheaper. And for those of you who prefer, you can probably go skiing during and parts of New Zealand if you want to check that off your list. Can't do that during the summer, but summer in New Zealand is very special. How? So those of you who, like me, are used to the infrastructure of Europe, that's not exist in New Zealand. Okay, so there's not Flixbus and Megabus like going around. And I want you to think when Europeans think about bus sizes, or even Americans, if you think about Greyhound, you're thinking about these large buses. But the New Zealand roads do not carry those large buses. I want you to imagine something that's half the size of that, something that seats maybe 16 to 20 people, and that has a trailer for your luggage. So in a separate, in something that's trailing behind. So there are a couple bus companies, but the trains, they're almost entirely for domestic tourism. So somebody who wants to take a train to one part, they'll drive their car, park it at the train station, and then take a train. So it's almost built up for domestic tourists who want to take the train, but it doesn't work in the effective way that it does in Europe. So Europe's the only continent in the world with the train and bus infrastructure. So it's not fair to compare Europe to anywhere else. But I just want to make it very, very clear to people that that infrastructure does not exist in New Zealand, and even among the buses. And I so 100% of the time we stayed in hostels. And so we were always talking with people about what they were doing and what their transportation options. And we ran into a girl in Rotorua who was stranded there for 9 days. Now, when I say stranded in quotes, because the bus company she bought a pass with, so it's something like 300 New Zealand dollars for 1 month unlimited rides. But it's like a Eurail pass in that you have to book a seat. So even though you have a pass, it doesn't mean you can just rock up to the bus and say, okay, I'm going to get on. You have to have made a reservation. The bus company she was with had no open spots leaving Rotorua for 9 days. So, and I told her, I thought it's got to be more expensive for you to stay in a hostel here for 9 days than for you to take some other means of transportation and get on. But the problem is, at that point too, sometimes there aren't other means available. And so I didn't get too much into it with her, but I did run into this recurring problem when I talked to people who were on the bus, that they said it doesn't allow for spontaneity. If you want to stay somewhere, then you have to think about rebooking your itinerary if you've already booked it ahead of time. So something to think about. It's definitely probably going to be your cheapest way around, and I think that's probably why it's chosen by many people. But it's tough, as far as I can tell, in terms of flexibility. And then there are certain places, it's nice that you got to a town, but you are not getting to a national park on a bus. A lot of those places, they also don't give you any flexibility. So you need to complete your hike in a certain amount of time to get there. God forbid that you don't complete the hike on time and the bus is left and you're at a parking lot with no cars there at the end of the day. These prices are current as of, I would even argue 2020, because I checked in January when I visited again to see a friend, I said, are these prices right? And we checked across some things and they were still right. Obviously, New Zealand's not open for tourism at the moment, so I can't argue about any of these prices. And what will it look like when it does open? I don't know. But I don't think that if New Zealand is open, that the demand is going to change. In fact, what you're looking at is a lot of pent-up demand. You have an entire year of people who had planned to go to New Zealand who weren't going to go. And then you have a bunch of people who, now that they were locked in their house, like, well, I was going to take that trip to New Zealand in 2 years, I'm going to go now. So these prices are accurate. And if you're like me, Mr. I like to pay $5 a night for a hostel. I like to cook a lot of my own food. I like to meet other couch surfing people, other people in town, and find ways to trade out talent and save money. It's very hurtful to see these prices. And there's just no getting around it. 46 euros per day per person. And I want to point that out. I was booking for everybody and I booked 6 months in advance. So I didn't know how drastic it was, but when we were about a month out, there was a possibility that we were going to change something. And I went to look at one of the dates and it's like sold out, sold out, sold out. It's like, okay, well, it was only a month before we were going to arrive. I had booked 6 months. The prices had only gone up. So those aren't even day of prices. Those are Stephen booked way in advance and stayed to a pretty rigid schedule. And so when we would go to hostels, sometimes it would be a room for 3 of us. And that was what we had. Or sometimes it was a room with 8 or 10 people. And it was funny too, because Terry had never stayed in a hostel in her life prior to this trip. And she was such a champ. There was one in Napier, we were at our worst hostel ever. One of the worst hostels I've ever stayed at in my life. But she champed through. I really appreciate that about her. So you look at those prices. Why is the food expensive? There's a couple interesting things here. For example, avocados are grown in New Zealand, so you can get an avocado for like 50 cents. Like we had avocados, I think, pretty much every day. But it's an island, so things they don't grow, they have to ship there expensively. Something else that's funny, 95% of New Zealand lamb is exported. So New Zealand lamb is expensive in New Zealand because most of it's shipped out. We ate a fair amount of lamb because I was like, I'm not eating lamb in New Zealand. And I happen to like lamb as well. But The cost of food, your 50-cent avocados are balanced out against other things that are just more expensive that have to get trucked in or brought in by ship. Car and gas, I want to point out, that is the Stephen doesn't take insurance rate. So I'm very much whatever's going to happen is going to happen, and I have the insurance that comes on my credit card. But I was like, if I get into an accident, I'll just have to deal with it. So that is not even including any insurance. That is just rental of the car and gas divided out, and then divided out among all of us. If you're wondering how to divide a trip, there's a really cool app called TriCount, TRICOUNT, and it keeps track of everything. It's so cool. And we were able to keep track. Camper van. Why did we not do a camper van? As I told you, we hadn't ever been together for more than 7 days. To then say we're going to be in the same vehicle and sleep in the same place and eat in the same place, that was a risk I was unwilling to take, shall we say. And the flip side of that is, yes, it is more expensive than the car, but people argue, yes, Stephen, but I'm going to live there, so I'm going to have some of the hostel savings. That is 100% true. But I also want you to think about your configuration. 2 people in a camper van, and when you think about a camper van, the different sizes, as you increase in camper van size, those prices go up geometrically. It's not like an arithmetic rise in prices. And then as you go through the roads in New Zealand, I want to, again, think it's a small country. There's not a bunch of freeways. There's a bunch of 2-lane, what do they call it in the UK, dual carriageways, but just single lanes. And so if you're in one of these big camper vans, you're going to be the slow one going up the hill, right? And everyone's going to be passing you, or you need to pull over a lot. So there's also some logistics. The one positive, which cannot be matched, is New Zealand is very liberal about where you can camp. There's a lot of places you can just drive up someplace and just park, as long as your camper van has a toilet. And so you need to have a certain classification of camper van, or it has a self-contained toilet. You're allowed to just park your camper van in the middle of nowhere. Mount Cook, for example, is one of the darkest places in the earth at night. So if you want to see stars, Mount Cook is, I think, one of the top 5 places to be in the world. You can just park your camper van somewhere near Mount Cook, usually. So if you're really into camping and you really know the people that you're traveling with, I would encourage you to think about a camper van. And also if money is not a problem, because obviously the gas mileage is not great for a camper van either. Read all about it. I will post a link to the Medium article that I wrote, which goes into much greater detail about this trip in general. So I'll put that in the chat in a moment. Someday ain't a day of the week. There are many, many people who have said that they're going to go to New Zealand someday. And the only reason that I was able to go, and the reason I'm able to give you this talk today, is because I didn't say someday I'm going to go to New Zealand. I said, I'm going to go on this day. I made plans with people and we went. And it was and still remains one of the best vacations of my life. And I could go on and on about it, but it's time for questions.
So I've got a bunch of questions here. I'll send them to you in the chat. Let's see. Did I send them to the right one?
Yeah.
There's cool. So now a lot of these you answered, but maybe we can start with this first one, because New Zealand is not open. When do you think it will be open?
You know, they took the path of eradication. So they were gonna not allow anyone in, and they wanted to have 0 cases and continue to have 0. Like they had a fake, like a mini lockdown recently for like 3 days, because I think they had 1 case and then they found out it wasn't actually a real case. And so I actually think, despite the fact that they're way ahead of many countries in terms of not having a lot, they're probably going to be one of the most careful, again, because they're an island. So I have no idea. I don't pretend to speak for the New Zealand Tourism Board.
Fair enough. From what last I heard, it was looking unlikely that
I
Australia,
mean,
New Zealand would be open
what's
this
interesting,
year.
they've been talking about doing travel bubbles between them and Taiwan and them and Australia, parts of Australia. They haven't even done that. They haven't even done travel bubbles with other COVID-free places. So I wouldn't get your hopes up. I wouldn't plan a trip for this year, for example. I think that's not a good idea.
And how is it driving? Driving in other countries can be, as I know from experience, hit or miss, sometimes literally.
Sure. Well, if you're not used to driving on the left side of the road, it's something to think about. I always make fun of myself. My first couple days, because as an American, I'm very trained to drive on the right. I have driven on the left in the Caribbean, in Australia, in the UK. But my first couple days in America, wherever the is for the windshield wipers is where so instead of turning on my turn signal or what the British would call an indicator, I turn on my windshield wipers, and it's always just funny for whoever's in the car. It's like, okay, but after a couple days, and also your brain thinking I'm shifting with this, where you've been trained to shift with your right hand, and everything's got to kind of. So I would argue if you enjoy driving, and that's a part of the journey that you want to do, driving's great. The roads are fine. They're small, but they're not potholes everywhere. It's a very wealthy country, so you're not gonna run into problems on the roads. It's just that the roads are not they're not multiple lanes, and interestingly enough, the traffic's much worse on North Island. Obviously, 75% of the population is up there. South Island's deserted. Like, I can't tell you how many times I climbed up I did a trail in South Island. I was by myself. It was high season in the summer, but South Island's so much less populated that you still feel like, wow, I have this place to myself. It's unbelievable.
Totally. Yeah. I had the same problem with the blinkers when I was driving in Scotland, but I went for an automatic. I paid extra because I was like, I don't want to doing a different side of the road and different hand shifting. I was like, not going to risk it.
Fair enough.
Here's a good question, because when it comes to flexibility, I mean, you hit on it a little bit about planning everything in advance,
Sure.
but what are your tips on like how much planning, what to plan, what can you just improvise?
So, and I see it says Chiara, so I guess maybe Italian, I'm guessing. As I said, it's a small country, so Iceland has the same issue where they're not building additional infrastructure to take on more tourists. They have a certain level that they're willing to take on themselves. So in peak season, it's really hard to get a room in a certain part. Like, if you tried to get one night, we were in Queenstown 3 nights. And we were talking to people, and one person wanted to extend. They're like, there's nothing available. In high season, even if you want to change your plans, there's not a lot of flexibility. So I'm not arguing against the spirit. I very much love the idea of being flexible. It's just that if you don't have a camper van, you don't have that flexibility. Camper van, you don't have to ask anybody for permission anytime, right? If you've pre-booked a place with the camper vans, there's always more infrastructure available, and there's so much free camping. There's so many parking lots in New Zealand that are legal for you to just park your camper van in, that you're never going to be stuck. So if you're not in a camper van, you simply don't have you don't have the ability to be flexible. Does that make sense? So I'm arguing for flexibility. I love that spirit, but if you are subject to the occupancy rates of wherever you're going to, you don't have as much choice, honestly. And there are towns you'll go to, and there's like 4 hostels. That's it. And they should have 9 hostels. But for whatever reason, the people who live in those towns don't want to run hostels. So they just don't have
them. And let's see. I saw one that I wanted to ask, and then I missed it here. Oh yeah, this is a good one. There's one thing that's common in Australia and also New Zealand is buying a car or a camper van if you're going to do a longer trip. Did you meet anybody doing that? Is that something you would recommend?
In fact, I was helping on my second day in Auckland. we were helping somebody do this where they were calling, we were helping them to, because we had New Zealand's SIM cards, and so we were calling around to help her try to find a car, a camp. She wanted a hatchback camper van just for herself, so it would allow her to sleep in this sort of hatchback back seat. It works out to about the same. So we found like you could drop like 2 or 3 thousand New Zealand dollars, buy it, and then you'd find buyers at the end. But the question is simply one of waiting. So I don't want to give the impression, A, you can just rock up and buy a vehicle when you want, or B, that someone is going to, you turn it in and then someone's like, oh, I'm here to buy your vehicle. Like, it's like buying and selling anything, that it may take 3 days, it may take 7 days, it may take 10 days. So it doesn't necessarily provide a lot of savings. And if that car breaks down, it's your car, you own it. So you are going to have to fix it. If your rental car breaks down, your rental car company has to fix it for you. So I would caution against it, only because it doesn't seem to provide a lot of savings. I think it's really great for people who are on working holidays. It was the impression that I got. But if you're renting, their rates are very competitive. What's interesting is it's expensive to import cars to New Zealand. So there's a huge market of 10-year-old rental cars. So the company I use, I think their name is Apex. Their entire fleet is like 10 years old, minimum. Some of them are like 15 years old. The cars are in wonderful working condition, but because they're not brand new cars, they don't have to charge you to recover the cost of it. So rental cars are really quite reasonable.
Cool. Alex just sent me a message about hitchhiking.
That is
that something?
that is such a big deal in New Zealand, and it's such a safe country that, like, if a bike gets stolen, that's national news. Now, obviously, I understand that there was that terrorist event, so I'm not trying to pretend that that didn't happen in New Zealand, but that hasn't changed the national character of New Zealand, and they still very much, it's like Denmark. You leave your baby pram outside while you go in to like have breakfast. Like, no one's going to run off with your baby. It's the same thing in New Zealand, that it's a very, very safe country. So you hitchhiking is so practiced. I ran into so many people who did, and they had so many cool stories. I remember running into a German girl in South Island, and she told me that it was like late at night, and like this farmer helped her, and she went back and they had dinner with the family, and like then she stayed like a couple. They were like, "You want to stay with us a couple days?" So there are some really, really cool stories. Obviously, take the normal precautions you would. I'm not trying to give a blanket endorsement of hitchhiking in New Zealand, but it's done in such a way that I've never been in a country where more people hitchhiked, and it was spoken about by both the locals and the tourists as normal. So it's done quite a lot.
Yeah, that's the impression that I've gotten. You know, I've done hitchhiking in a bunch of countries, and what I always sort of hear is that, like, if you're new to hitchhiking, two of the best places to start are Iceland and New Zealand, because there's so many people with cars, like other travelers who will pick you up, and it's super, super safe for anybody interested. Question about SIM cards, Wi-Fi,
Sims,
all that stuff.
Sims are super cheap. I don't want to give the impression that the internet is amazing in New Zealand. Keep in mind that New Zealand gets its internet from Australia. Like, it's at the bottom of the world, and so there's a giant trunk line. They basically get Australia's backwash internet. So the country's internet is neither super fast nor very prevalent. So even maybe if you're in Auckland or Wellington, it's fine, and there's a fair amount of public Wi-Fi. But even when you're driving, and we had, all three of us had data plans, New Zealand data plans, there's still large parts of South Island where there's nothing, not like one bar. Like like you're in an airplane, like like no contact. So don't get the impression that even if you had a New Zealand SIM card, that you're going to be constantly connected to the internet. The country itself is not really wired up in that way. So there is a lot of free Wi-Fi. And if you're not really that bothered about the internet, if, like, for example, Chris and I we both have gigs that require us to be connected to the internet. So we probably couldn't do that. But if you're not really bothered, then, I would just go off of Wi-Fi. Although I will tell you, it's not that expensive. Maybe we're talking like 50 or $60 for like 5 gigs of internet. And between that and Wi-Fi, you should be good for your 30 days, unless you are, I don't know, you're trying to watch some movies on it. Well, that's your problem. It is, and I want to point out, in almost all of the hostels, it's metered. So because the country itself doesn't have a lot of internet, they're not like giving out like lots of internet when you get to it. So you're like, oh, I'm in a Wi-Fi spot, I'm going to watch a movie tonight. Like, if your movie is less than 500 megs, maybe, but the internet is metered. So you're not going to get unlimited internet when you get to a hostel. Just most of the time you're not. I'd say 90% of the time you're not.
Which, I mean, is probably for the best in many ways, especially at a hostel. You know, that reminds me of like the olden days of being at a hostel when people actually talk to one another instead of just sitting on their phones. But that's a rant for another day. Big question. Did you do any bungee jumping?
I did not bungee jump.
Or other extreme sports?
I didn't do any extreme stuff. I think I probably got that all out of my system. I did a month in Australia when I was younger, and I went skydiving, I went hot air ballooning, I went shark diving. I did a lot of, I don't know, the extreme stuff. And New Zealand for me was just about really taking in nature. That isn't to say, I will tell you, if you want that stuff, it is there in spades. The original like place where you bungee jump in South Island, it is there. It's just outside of Queenstown. If you want to whitewater raft, if you want to do all of that stuff, they have it. I will point out, it's XXX dollars. So all the prices I gave you so far, it's just gas, food, hostel. And even though I love to cook, and I cooked like 80% of the time when I was there, when you think about, oh, what's native New Zealand cuisine? It's a sort of pan-Asian edge of Asia flair, but there's a lot of essentially UK pub food cuisine as well. So it wasn't like, oh, it like the opposite for me would be like Thailand. I would never cook in Thailand ever. Like I would be out eating every single night, every single meal, because it's actually either the same or more expensive to cook in Thailand as it is to buy street food. Whereas in New Zealand, it's quite expensive to eat out. And we still did. We had special meals where we went out and we treated ourselves, but I cooked a lot of those meals. So anytime you're looking at one of those extreme things like bungee jumping's like at least 150, maybe a couple $100. And it looks like a lot of fun. I'm not trying to discourage people. I just want to point out cost-wise, something to think about.
And can you, John was just wondering about prices. Can you jump back to your price slide just so folks can get another quick glance?
So there again, 52 US dollars, 46 euros per day per person. Someone had put a question about elder hostels or senior discounts. There are no senior discounts, but I will argue that we're quite blended. So you're going to see older people with younger people in the hostels. It's just a question of comfort, but there are no senior hostels. Unfortunately, there was one of my very favorite hostels is in Wanaka, and they had, you cannot believe this, they had a community garden. So it's like, did I want to go pick some chard for dinner? We went out to the community garden of the hostel, picked some chard, and like made it part of our dinner. Like, you want to talk about eating local? That was really, really awesome. Speaking of which, that reminds me. But wait, there's more. So if you contributed to today's event, or you are already a Nomadic Mat Patreon subscriber, I'm offering 15% off any of my courses, as well as a 15-minute phone call free to talk about your itinerary. As well as my list of the best hostels in New Zealand that I've been to. All you have to do is email me your Patreon receipt or your receipt for today's event. If you didn't contribute, if you just managed to come to today's event for free, that's okay. If you make a contribution, any amount, and send me the receipt to steven@thelifeyouwant.eu, I will send you the coupon code. I will send you a schedule for a 15-minute phone call. I will send you the really cool hostels. Some of these places, you know, you have free dinner every night. Some of these places have music at night. So lots of cool stuff. And I think that is the end of that presentation.
Awesome. Stephen, you just want to throw your email in the chat just one last time. So if anybody can email your receipts. For those of you interested, you can click the 3 little dots in the bottom corner and save the chat, or I think it says file. You should be able to save the chat. So in case you want to get anything from the chat, you can definitely do that.
Did anyone have a question they wanted to ask that didn't get asked? I want to make sure that we're addressing everything. Otherwise, Chris is going to do his regular wrap-up stuff.
Adam's got a question here. Let's see. Adam, you can either type your question in or unmute yourself, whatever you prefer. Here we go.
Okay, so I covered all of this in the presentation. So if you want to watch the replay, you'll be able to see it. But just to answer quickly, each of them, the best months I continue to advocate would be summer. So that's going to be December through March. The minimum amount of time you should visit would be at least 30 days. And for any of you who've never taken a 30-day vacation, I have to argue that it's maybe the minimum amount of time for your brain to start adjusting to being on vacation and for you to start asking some of the really tough questions about your life. And I feel like 30-day vacations are like retreats. Like you take them at these crucial parts of your life. And obviously 30 days a minimum, I would argue for more, but I took my first 30-day vacation in 2012 when I went to Australia after I sold my business. And it wasn't until like day 11 that I forgot what day of the week it was. And the momentum was building for these key questions. What is it that I want to do with my life? Am I happy with how things are? And 30 days on a meta level for you as a traveler, I think are really key. For New Zealand, I don't think it's possible. And I want you to think about the logistics of getting down there. It's a 24-hour journey from Paris. So I went Paris to Zurich, Zurich to Hong Kong to Auckland on Swiss Air. You can also do like a direct, maybe from some other place. It is a long time to be on an airplane. So if you're going to go all the way down there, like you're going to go down there for 2 weeks, like maybe if I lived in Asia, I would go for 2 weeks because it's nearby, but I would never spend less than a month, especially with the idea this is not the last time I'm going to go to New Zealand. And I think that's a good attitude to have about travel in life in general, even if that's not true. Even if you go to a place and you're like, I'm never going there again. Your attitude going in should be, this isn't the last time. Otherwise, like most Americans, you're going to have the, I want to see 42 cities in 20 days disease. And not only will you not remember any of those cities, halfway through, you're going to get ill. So I really would argue if you're going to go down to New Zealand, if you're going to spend the money and be down there, you should go for 30 days. And then the last question, what's the perfect itinerary? There is no perfect itinerary. The perfect itinerary is what matters to you. Where are you going to see? So for example, if you're a wine junkie, the perfect itinerary would be just hanging out at all the wine places. If you're a Lord of the Rings person, going to Rivendell, going to Hobbiton, going to the part in Wellington where the Paths of the Dead were, and walking through there and pretending that you're Legolas or Gimli or whoever you want to be. So the perfect itinerary highlights what matters to you. What I did with my friends, we did a really great cross-section. We did lots of different things. And again, with the idea of it being a survey, taste a lot of things, get a sense of what you like. And then when, not if, when we went back to New Zealand, we were going to double down on what we liked and also go to see the things that we didn't. So the places that we didn't go, the north of the North Island and the south of the South Island, there are islands off the coast of North Island. There are islands off the coast of South Island, especially some very famous islands. There's a very wonderful book called Island of the Lost by Joan Druitt that talks about some people who were lost on an island that's far off the coast of New Zealand, actually. Down there is Doubtful Sound, Dunedin. There's some really, really beautiful parts of South Island. So we're going to go there on our next trip. But I knew that going into this, I knew what we were not going to see. And I was at peace with that.
I wholeheartedly agree about the 30 days. Great tip, just a general tip. John had another question. Ballpark, what would you suggest people sort of aim to budget for a month?
Are you camper vanning? Are you driving? Are you taking a bus? I would go back to that slide where I talked about per person per day. So
Yeah, that slide was a little confusing, or trying to digest the numbers on that. You had food, you had car, and you had hostel. How much was it just for the hostel? John?
you're asking how much the hostel was?
Yeah, because you, in that diagram that you shared with all of us,
Yes.
you had, in addition to the hostel, you had food and car. I couldn't tell what the hostel cost was. Was the hostel including the car rental?
No, let me show it just so that everyone understands what you're talking about.
Sure.
Okay, so the hostel and the food and the car and gas are all separate costs. There's no reason why any of those would have anything to do with each other.
Okay,
Hostel is accommodations, food is food, and car and gas is transportation. So add that all up. So let's round, let's say 40 times 3. That's 120 euros a day just to sleep, eat, and get around. That's no bungee jumping, that's no wine tasting. A lot of the wine tasting in New Zealand is free. It operates like France, with the idea someone in your party is going to buy a bottle, but they aren't going to get mad at you if you don't. But you're saying 120 euros a day per person per day. So do the math, 10 days would be 1,200 euros. So 30 days could be 3,600 euros.
can you put that in US dollars?
I got it right here.
They're all right. They're all right there.
So you're looking at, just to cut in, you're looking at about 140 bucks a day, bare minimum. So if you times that by 30, you're looking at $4,200.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
And I want to be clear, I probably spent more than that. And it was the best money that I've spent. I don't know, other vacations, but New Zealand costs a lot because already it's a very developed country. It's a very wealthy country. But I think part of the challenge, I told people that if New Zealand were any closer, everyone would go. This price that you see, this is still the price of people who are like, I'm going to take a 24-hour flight and go. Like, if New Zealand's not close for anyone, I often laugh, people like, oh, I'm going to go to Australia and then I'm going to go to New Zealand for a week. I'm like, dude, it's a 4-hour flight from New Zealand to Australia. That's like saying, oh, I'm in Miami for a week, so I think I'll go to Medellin. It's like, it's faster to go from Medellin to Miami than it is to go from Auckland to any part of Australia. So it's not on the way to anything. I would really discourage people from doing I'm going to go down and see Australia and New Zealand. Like, they both deserve your time. And if you want to say, I'm going to do a month in Australia and a month in New Zealand, I would back that plan. But I wouldn't try to do 2 weeks in Australia and 2 weeks in New Zealand. Like, you'll hate yourself. You really will.
I think the jet lag alone, because I was looking at flight times earlier today just to see, and it's like a 25-hour flight. So not only is that a whole day, but you're going to be jet lagged. Like, for those of you who fly, I fly back to Canada often, and I'm usually just 3 days minimum. So, and that's like an 8-hour flight. So if you think about how disoriented you're going to be, you need to really buffer in some time. Otherwise, you're just going to be
bring sunscreen and apply it frequently, especially during the summertime. I paid in Auckland for that, not thinking about that my first day. I had a burn that started peeling a week later.
Important tip. Any other questions? Alex was wondering about busking. Did you see any buskers? Did he break out?
I did, but again, it's not the European thing where you can do that a lot. It's not something in the Kiwi culture. It's obviously, people who are busking are generally tourists, but people are pretty friendly to them. But you're not gonna clean house like you can. Like, I know people who busk in Europe during the summertime, and they clean up in a lot of these big cities, and they can live off of that money. And I don't want to give you the impression that that's the same in New Zealand at all.
I will, for those of you and I'm not speaking from experience, but we had an event on woofing earlier this week, and that's something that you can do in New Zealand if paying $140 a day is not ideal. You work on farms in exchange for room and board. So that's definitely an option. The website, I think, is just woof.net, I believe.
There's also house sitting that's available. I think it's trustedhousesitters.com. So
Yes.
maybe now keep in mind, if you're house sitting, you cannot like go on a trip. So like maybe you house sit like in a cool town like Wellington or some other place and really get to know Wellington well, but you can't really house sit and then peace out. That's the whole reason your house. And maybe your house sitting person will let you do that, but I just want to keep that in mind. Sometimes people have taken that up and it's worked out badly because they were expected to house sit.
Totally. Any last questions before we wrap things up?
How many months can you stay there?
As for a US citizen and an EU citizen, it's a 90-day visa waiver, but America started doing this and then everyone else sort of followed suit. So again, as usual, America is the source of a lot of problems in the world, but there's something called the ESTA. And so it's, even though we're a visa waiver country with New Zealand, even though we both have visa waivers, we have now basically put a toll in place for Kiwis. And so the Kiwis are like, okay, well, we're going to put a toll bridge for you too. So even though we're visa waiver countries where we can go for 90 days, you now need to register ahead of time. You'll get it instantly. So I don't give you this idea that it's a visa application, but you just need to pay anywhere between 15 and 40, and it's usually good for 1 year. So you can come back on that ESTA, and it varies for different nationalities. So I can only speak for EU and US nationalities that we have a 90-day visa waiver program. I think the British do as well. I think the British have a 90-day visa waiver as well. In fact, yeah, they signed one of their first trade deals post-Brexit, they signed with the Kiwis. So I'm almost certain they do.
Cool. All right. If there are no other questions, then we will wrap things up. Stephen's got his email in the chat if you do end up having a question. We'll wrap up Airbnb. Stephen?
It's available. I'm a hostel person. I love meeting people. I love getting tips from other people on the trail. I love socializing. Like at one of the hostels in Queenstown, we watched Lord of the Rings, like in New Zealand, like meta. But Airbnbs, as far as I could tell, were alive and healthy and doing well. So if that's your jam, I would encourage you to look at that. I'm such an advocate. I know Matt is as well, of hostels, that I can't escape. That's who I am. I'm a hostel person. So I'm a hostel person. Hopefully not too hostile.
I fully agree with you on hostels. Love them. Even when I hate them, I still always go back. All right, that was awesome. I'm sure many of you are inspired to book a trip as soon as you can. I'm already got the wheels turning. But thank you everyone for coming out today. Special thanks to our returning travel guru, Stephen, for sharing his insights. If any of you are interested in a replay of this or replay of any of our other events, if you're too busy, they don't work out the time zone, they're all on Patreon. I upload videos every week so that people don't miss out. And there's tons of other content there. So do check that out if it's something you're interested in. There's tons of exclusive stuff in addition to the replays. So you're not just getting the replays. There's lots of cool stuff there. That again, even stories that I've never heard. Matt, there's one like Matt was boxing in Thailand and got beat up, and there's lots of cool stories. So do check that out if you're interested. And we do have, as always, tons more events coming up on nomadicnetwork.com/events. We've got a bunch of happy hours. So regardless of where you are in the world, there's probably a happy hour coming up near you. We've got a St. Patrick's Day cooking class, which is going to be super interesting. Matt's doing one on newsletter marketing for any bloggers or people who work online. So lots of sort of practical hands-on talks coming up. So do sign up for those, and you can find all the rest of our events, including upcoming book clubs, at thenomadicnetwork.com/events. And so that is everything for me. Again,
there's an awesome book club coming up in May with Rolf Potts, which should not be list.
Yes, if anyone hasn't read any of Rolf's books,
Let's stop what you're doing now. Go get Vagabonding and read. Chris, I also realized I didn't mention that I promised 15% off the courses. Just the courses that I have are on how to be an Airbnb superhost, how to use Meetup, how to start a business, traveling, how to start a business. So if people are interested in any of those topics, they might be interested in those courses.
Totally. You can find Stephen's links on the Nomadic Network page. And Stephen, do you want to throw your blog, the website in there just so people can make it easy? They're all on the website, and you'll get a follow-up email with all of his links as well for social media and that. So if you want to check out his courses, you can do that. And so that is all for me. Stephen, again, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming out.
Thank you everybody for your time. I hope you make it to New Zealand, not someday.
Thank you. All the best.
Bye-bye.
All right, take care, everybody.